Hello friends, welcome to the EduSite Network. Our today's topic of discussion is literary theory, and we're going to talk about realism in literary theory. For this, we have with us in the studio Dr. Anand Prakash, Professor, English Literature, and he has taught English Literature from 1965 to his retirement in 2007. His publications include Wuthering Heights and Interpretation, Marxist Literary Theory, and he has also published the edited volume of Our Story. Additionally, there is the full-length study of Mukti Bodh titled Mukti Bodh in Our Time. Currently, he is editing Journal of Drama Studies. It's an international journal of research on world drama. And he is also editing the Hindi journal Yug Paribodh. Thank you for being here, sir. We welcome you, and we request you to begin the lecture.
Thank you, Urvashi. And your appreciative comments, I think, will add some kind of courage to me to present the argument regarding which you have correctly announced as literary theory realism. And since you also referred to my role in Hindi writing, so let me bring that in and say that the word yatharthvad in Hindi is very popular. In fact, in current criticism, if a writer is not supposed to be, is not yatharthvadi, then the writer is not worth much. In fact, this phase of yatharthvad in Hindi writing began in the early 20th century, and the first major writer of yatharthvad, that is realism, was Premchand. Of course, there were others in other languages, like in Bangla and other languages. There were writers who also swore by the word yatharthvad. So today we are taking up that aspect of literary theory which explains and emphasizes realism. And realism is a more commonplace kind of an expression, in the sense that all of us always talk about the real or the imaginary in life. And the word real is quite clear to us. We know what real is. Real is that which we can perceive with our senses, that we see, that we can hear, that we can touch. That is real. And if somebody weaves a thought pattern, a theory around the real, then that endeavor would be called realism. So which means there must be certain things in the practice of being realistic, which are common to all realistic writers, and it is these that we will be discussing today. In the 20th century, particularly in Western Europe, the word realism was more in vogue in the 19th century than it was in the 20th century. And the reason was that the 19th century ethos in Europe was marked by certain thinkers, certain analysts, certain scholars who would always analyze the existing phenomena from an objective angle. So they were realists in that sense. They would not bring in their own prejudices, their own preconceptions. They would write what they saw, and they would share that which they felt to be true. And it was more popular a concept in the 19th century for the reason that the 19th century thinkers were very courageous and daring in their approach and outlook. And one reason could be that the 19th century writers were directly associated with the reader, with the person who would go and buy a magazine, go and buy a book, and would start reading and would be in touch with the writer. So the writer kept this in mind, that his writing was read by the common masses, the common literate masses, who would wait for the writer to finish one's writing, and then that would be published. And as soon as it was published, it would be bought by the readers. The practice of going to the market, buying a book, and then coming back and starting reading. Why I emphasize this aspect, you might be wondering, and I say this, that the scene in literature and in culture has changed in the 20th century, particularly in Europe. Now people, the common reader is not generally connected with the major literary writers of the time. They read literature, of course, but that literature is popular literature, which is slightly lower in the scale of literary value and worth. And the serious literature, as we call it today, is not as appealing as it may have been in the 19th century. So maybe for that reason, the 20th century writing is not very popular, serious writing. And this is read more by, let's say, the critics, by the teachers, by those students who specialize in the study of literature, and well, that which is discussed in the classroom. So realism in the 20th century would be denoting more of a theoretical aspect than a real aspect. Now imagine I'm using the word realism and real, but then really speaking, realism will not be discussed in the 20th century as much as it was done in the it was discussed in the 19th century. Anyway, I'm taking up certain basic aspects of realism, that people became aware of in the 19th century, and because there was no critic, there were very few critics in the 19th century who take up the question of realism. Therefore, the word realism would occur generally in the letters that writers exchanged with one another, or the letters that thinkers would write to the writers, and the writers writing back to the thinker. So that kind of, and in those discussions the word realism started occurring in the middle of the 19th century, and it is because, and that was actually the aspect that everybody wanted to understand, wanted to adopt also in one's writing. And if it was a serious reader like a scholar, then the serious scholar would look for the real or the realistic in literature. So I'm going to present then realism in two forms. One that it is tentative, it is exploratory, it's initial, it is the primary, and in the other sense that these people were actually wedded to the cause of realism, and that they wanted to tell people what they were surrounded by, which problems they faced, and how they had to understand those problems. So anyway, I'll come to that, but first, there is a person who is very popular in French literature in the 19th century, and he calls himself not a writer, he calls himself a historian, which is very interesting. And he says, that he doesn't write. Then one may ask, who writes then? And he would say, well, history writes itself, and I am its secretary. I think I quoted this in one of the earlier discussions also. And the person will say that he is only the secretary of history, and he's communicating what history would communicate, with the reader. So this person is Balzac, and Balzac in the 19th century was a major writer, and he appealed to lots and lots of people. And if he had certain problems, then those problems were discussed by writers and thinkers of the period. So I quote Balzac's sentences to discuss to begin the discussion on realism. And this is the quotation. He talks in the first person and says, I attach to common daily facts, hidden or patent to the eye, to the act of individual lives, and to their causes and principles, the importance which historians have hitherto ascribed to the events of public national life. Now look at this sentence. He is using words which are, which will always draw attention for their being somewhat non-literary. He is not telling us about pleasure, he is not talking about human relations, he is talking about facts, daily facts. And what slightly poses a problem to me is the word hidden to the eye. Patent is fine, clear is fine, but why is he saying that there are facts which are hidden to the eye? So I think viewers, you have to understand that there are certain facts which remain hidden to the eye, and that the writer will take you to those areas where these facts actually relate, where they exist. And therefore realism is not that which you see, merely, but also that which is hidden to the eye. And then he goes further to the act of individual lives. So he will talk about not merely circumstances in that sense, but the life lived by an individual. How an individual decides regarding certain things. How does he accept certain principles? How does the individual reject certain others? So he will go into these areas, he says in his writing, and to their causes and principles. Now this is very serious, serious in the good sense of the word, because the writer will allow the reader to enter his own domain, that is reader's own domain. The reader will introspect, and in the process of introspecting, the reader will become aware about the causes of his own behavior. So the causes and principles, and then he says the importance which historians have hitherto ascribed to the events of public national life. So he says that he is adopting the stance of history and historians, and he is talking about the public national life. Now viewers, it's very significant that Balzac is mixing words so very cleverly in order to say that it's not easy to be real and it's not easy to be realistic, because the writer has to play the role of the historian, and the writer has to always keep one's eye on the public national life. So now public national life requires a whole essay to discuss as to what is public national life, but then Balzac takes his job of writing very seriously, and therefore he will be wedded to the cause of realism this way, and this is realism for him. So immediately as I start explaining realism, I realize that it's not that simple, that ordinary common reader will not easily understand what is real, and that the writer's job is to assist him or her to understand what is real in the novel, in the short story, in the play, and in the life of the individual oneself. So this is how, and this statement occurred in one of his essays, which is titled "Society as Historical Organism." I take another quotation from the same essay, and this is how the essay ends. He talks about a plan first. I'll discuss that after I have read it. The vastness of a plan, which includes both a history and a criticism of society, an analysis of its evils, and a discussion of its principles, authorizes me, I think, in giving my work the title under which it now appears, The Human Comedy. Is this too ambitious, he says? Is it not exact? That when it is complete, the public must pronounce. Now, once again, he is repeating certain points that he emphasized in the previous quotation, but then one word that strikes us is human comedy. And this is a title. This is a title of all his novels, in fact. All his novels had this common title called The Human Comedy. And after The Human Comedy, there will be an individual title given to his novels. And viewers, Balzac didn't write one or two novels only. He wrote more than 40, and if he had a longer life, if he had another 15-20 years, then he had a plan to write more than 100 novels. And he said in those novels he will describe the life of France in different parts of its existence. He will, for instance, go to the villages, he will go to the cities, he will go to the small towns, he will go to the market, he will talk about princes, he will talk about all aspects of life. In fact, he had laid out a whole plan that he's going to cover all aspects of the French life in his novels, and this is what he talks about, the vastness of the plan, as he calls it. But then, what is human comedy? Why is he not writing tragedy? This is a question that as a literary theorist one may ask, and you are all students of literature, study literature in the classroom, you also write about literature. So one has to ask this question, why is he calling all his novels, all his fiction, the human comedy? And the answer is that, and this makes him realistic. Such a statement would be a stupid statement in times of Shakespeare, because those times were actually tragic times. But 19th century is a comic time. And comic not in the sense that we laugh when we read a novel as human beings. It only means, it primarily means that comedy is that vision of life which accepts life and which also has the feeling behind it that problems of life can be solved and that success is always assured at the end. So when you know that the ending is going to be successful, ending is going to be happy, then it will be a comedy. And he's sure about the 19th century France and about the 19th century world in general that things will emerge as problems, but those problems can be solved. And if they can be solved, then of course it will end comically in the comic way. So here comedy means positive thought. So he's in a way going to share the positive thought through his writing with the audience, with the readers. So one can say that realism in the 19th century is that particular view which recognizes the positive aspects of life and which emphasizes them and which conveys the message that, well, there might be problems in life, but those problems can be solved. So I hope that these will stick in your mind, this idea of being positive about life and taking up issues in order to share their positive solution, their possible solution with the audience. This is an important aspect of realism, and this is how Balzac, he's one of the first writers who uses the term real and realism, and he associates realism with history, as you have seen. Now I take you to the end of the 19th century when serious thinkers started discussing problems of literature, not in books. They did not have the time in the 19th century to discuss literary books. So there were no literary critics, too many. There might have been a few, those who discussed literature. The major figure in English criticism in the 19th century is Matthew Arnold. There is Hazlitt before him. But then they are few and far between. There wouldn't be a plethora of critics in the 19th century. And serious thinkers who were active in other areas of life, they would be generally discussing the novel and the literary writing, and then in those discussions certain principles would emerge. So I'm now giving you 2 or 3 quotations from the thinker called Engels, who was a close associate of Marx and who didn't have time to ever write about literature, nor did Marx for that matter. But since we in the previous lecture discussed Marxist theory, and Marxist theory emphasizes realism, therefore I have picked up the quotations of Engels himself to find out and to share with you as to what realism means in the case. He is writing to a writer. Franz Mehring is the name of the writer to whom he is writing, and he is telling him certain things which in 20th century we discuss all the time, but in the 19th century we did not generally discuss. Let me read this quotation. It's part of a letter that he wrote to this writer called Franz Mehring. Ideology is a process which is indeed accomplished consciously by the so-called thinker, but it is the wrong kind of consciousness. The real motive forces impelling him remain unknown to the thinker. Otherwise, it simply would not be an ideological process. Hence, he imagines false or illusory motive forces. Because it's a process of thinking, he derives its form as well as its content from pure reasoning, either his own or that of his predecessors. So, I will take up the question of ideology. Ideology is the pattern of thought, that is your thinking, the nature of your thinking, the activity of your thinking, which has become consistent in your mind, in my mind, and therefore it can be called ideology. So, you can straight away say that the writer has an ideology. The writer thinks all the time, even when he is not writing, even when he is living the ordinary life on the ordinary plane, and that when he writes, then this ideology in his mind, which is deeply ingrained in his mind, this ideology affects and influences his life. And now see the irony that is built in the statement. He says, accomplished consciously by the so-called thinker. This is one aspect of ideology. You know, that the so-called thinker thinks, you know, that this is what he wants to share. But then he says, it's the wrong kind of consciousness. If I say about my ideas, that these are my ideas and I'll tell you what they are, am I conscious that, my ideas can be wrong? So this is the question that all of us have to ask from ourselves. When I express my opinion, when I express my ideas to the people, then am I conscious that my ideas can be wrong? Now this is what separates one's real ideas and one's conscious ideas. In fact, consciously all of us think that we are right, but then it's not a question of our conscious thinking. What is important is whether they are really convincing or not. So this has to be kept in mind, and therefore consciousness can be false consciousness. In fact, most of us, I think viewers, you would agree with me, and I keep thinking about myself also, that in most of the cases later on I find that what I expressed as ideas were wrong, and that the reality was totally different. So if my ideas can be wrong, then it means that I have to learn not from my own ideas, but from the reality that I confront. And therefore I should keep, as an individual, I should keep changing my ideas to fall in line with the pattern of reality that exists in front of me. Hence he imagines false or illusory motive forces, etc. I think I have explained this, that the writer examines his own ideas, examines his own ideology, finds it wrong, and the real guide of the writer and the thinker is not his own thoughts. The real guide is the actual situation which is around him, which surrounds him, and which he watches. So I think this realism then would tell us that we should examine our ideas, because they might be wrong. How many of us have the courage to examine our ideas to find out that they might be wrong? So realism has to make us conscious about this aspect of our own ideas, and the writer is constantly presenting his ideas, at the same time examining his ideas. So this is another aspect of realism that one should think of, that realism is not a static doctrine. It's not a set of principles. You can't say these are the 10 things, and since they are real, therefore repeating them would make me realistic. Not at all. In fact, we should examine not merely the facts around us, but also our own ideas, and then see whether our ideas about the facts that confront us are wrong or right. So in a simple way, what I am saying is that when I write, my writing can be wrong, and that I have to bear this responsibility of examining my own views. Then he continues further in the same letter. He, means the writer, works consciously with thought material, which he accepts without examination as something produced by reasoning, and does not investigate further for a more remote source independent of reason. Indeed, this is a matter of course to him, because as all action is mediated by thought, it appears to him to be ultimately based upon thought. So here the letter ends, and I have already explained the idea that when the writer goes there to address the reader, then he has to realize that most of his ideas are mediated by thought. So they are not real thought. They are mediated, means influenced by thought. And if they are influenced by his own thought, then they might be unreal, they might be wrong, or even acceptable. So viewers, this is what is brought in the discussion by Engels when he writes to Franz Mehring, and he is making the writer conscious that in order to become a realistic writer, he should examine his own ideas to find out whether they are real or not. Then there is a woman writer, and it's an English writer this time, and he is writing to her. She is a novelist. Her name is Minna Kotsky, and he writes this letter in 1885. And let me just on the on the side tell you that 1885 was the year when Engels was alone, and he had lost his friend Karl Marx, who died sometime in the early 80s. So he is writing a letter, and in that letter once again he grapples with the question of realism, and he says this: each of the characters in your novel is a type, but at the same time also a definite individual. This one, as old Hegel would say, and that's how it should be. Now imagine, this is a seminal principle of realism. That realism, in fiction particularly, because 19th century was dominated by fiction writing, in fiction particularly, the important reality is captured not through description alone, not through detailing of the facts that are around oneself, but through characters. So you imagine a character who is there in a life situation, and there the character moves around in a novel, and he says that this character is to be a type, which is a good thing. Actually, most of us think that the character should not be a type. So when you read novels, you realize that the writer is all the time searching for somebody who doesn't exist and whom only he knows and nobody else does. But then, if the character is not a type, then the reader will not be interested in reading about him. So therefore, the type character, typical character, who is a typical character? Friends, those of you who are students in colleges would say, I would realize that if I have to call you a typical student, then you have certain tendencies which are common to all the students. That's called typical. So a typical person generally brings in one's own category or one's own class. So a typical peasant, a typical clerk, a typical teacher, a typical bureaucrat. So these are typical characters. When you have to think of a bureaucrat, then it should not be just one bureaucrat you are talking about. You are talking about all the bureaucrats who are somehow there in the behavior and the mind of this one particular bureaucrat. So that is what is typical, and it is this typicality which will make the novel realistic according to Engels. So keep this in mind, because in the 20th century criticism, this typicality will be attacked by certain writers of fiction, not realistic, but certain writers of fiction. So therefore, this is a principle that one has to keep in mind always, that if you are writing a novel, if you are in fact also writing a play, then the character that you pick up should be a typical character. The character should resemble all those to whose category this one character selected by the writer belongs. And then he makes it complicated now to say that that typical person should be also a definite individual. How come? Isn't it a contradiction? I believe it's not a contradiction, because this is the basic principle of realistic theory of realism, that even though the character is is typical, at the same time this character is individual in the situation. So it's not a contradiction, it's a paradox. It's a paradox that the teacher in the novel would look like all teachers. At the same time, when he makes a choice, when he behaves according to that choice, when he communicates his feelings and views to others, then he is alone, he is a definite individual then. So in a way, the typical character and the individual character, these two fuse into the realistic novel. These fuse into the point of view of reality. And that's why he quotes Hegel here, okay, this person should be this one, and how it should be. How it should be would relate to all of us. But this one, that is the character whom we are watching. So he's quoting this, and this is a fundamental principle of realism. And if you understand this, then perhaps you will grasp the situation of realism in the 19th century still better. Now, Urvashi, you are an expert student of literature. You have done your masters already, and you are doing your PhD. Now tell me whether I have been able to explain this paradox of a person being a typical person, at the same time an individual.
Sir, absolutely, as you were explaining, I could understand the idea that say a character could be typical in a way that all teachers maybe, say we think of a particular caricature, say, of a teacher, say that a teacher has to be serious and a teacher has to instill discipline in the students and have a command of the subject matter, but at the same time they can be definite individuals, whereas one may emphasize on a certain thing, the other may be of a different say belong to a different school of thought, but they all might be good teachers and still thinking for the good of the student.
I think you understood it quite clearly. I'll take another example to make it still more clear, that all of us, those who live in Delhi, can be called Delhiites, but we never realize that we belong to Delhi. But once we go out, let's say once we go to south or to eastern parts, then somebody can come out and say, are you from Delhi? Are you a Delhiite? Now, what is it in us that strikes them as Delhiite in us? So this is what is typicality, that we behave typically like Delhi walas. So somebody from Haryana, somebody from Punjab, somebody from UP can be called a typical UP wala. So what is that in every person belonging to UP or Haryana or Punjab, which makes this person typically of that place? So that is typicality. At the same time, that all people in Haryana, all people in Punjab are different from one another. So they are all individuals. So this aspect of human character is picked up and sharply detailed in the realistic fiction, and therefore this is the point of realism that we are trying to understand, particularly in the 19th century sense. Then the question of partisan writing, which is also realistic writing. If you are a realist, then you should not merely say things. You must also take a position. You must say that this thing is wrong and that thing is right. Maybe your understanding of the wrong or right is itself wrong. That's a different thing. But the writer should always take a position in literature. He should have a moral point of view. The moral point of view doesn't mean that he should start preaching, but then somewhere in the representation, behind the representation, there should be some principle working, and that principle is the principle of position, that this is from where you speak, and this position makes a writer partisan. But then the realistic writer in the 19th century was criticized by certain people for being taking only a side, for being of one side only. So the reader would say, or the thinker would say, well, you belong to that side, and because you belong to that side, therefore your understanding of the situation is only fragmentary. It's only of one side, it's one-sided, and unless you understand both the sides, how can you write well? This is the kind of criticism. But then the other position is, the realistic position is, that you cannot be realistic unless you take a position, unless you say this is wrong and that is right. So that way the writer in the 19th century started discussing for himself the attitude which is called partisan attitude, that you belong to this particular section of society in terms of supporting it. So that is what is called partisan. So if you are a socialist, then your partisanship is that of socialism. If you are a feminist, then you take up the cause of women and then you fight for them. So you are that way taking the side of. So being a partisan means to take the side of a particular section of society. And obviously there are sections in society which are more useful than others. All sections of society are not equally wrong or right. Some sections are more right and certain others are less. We always know this. I started with a discussion with a reference to Premchand, who would always say that even though peasants are wrong, but peasantry as a class is the productive class, and he will sympathize with this class. So Premchand in that sense is a partisan writer. In the case of Shakespeare, he would always say that a person who is away from authority, who is away from the court, who is away from privilege, is a person who will be genuine. So Shakespeare is a partisan writer in that sense. Premchand is a partisan writer in that sense, that they identify certain sections and they start supporting them, and from their angle they look at the world. So this partisanship also is an important aspect of realism, and partisan not in the blind sense, but partisan in the sense of being aware. And then Engels discusses this in a letter. Now imagine how convincing he would be, how much more convincing he would be if he were writing an essay. But in a letter he says this: I am by no means opposed to partisan poetry as such, like others, that is, both Aeschylus, the father of tragedy, and Aristophanes, the father of comedy, were highly partisan poets. He is taking the example from ancient writing. Dante and Cervantes were no less. And the best thing that can be said about Schiller's Cabell and Liebe, this is a novel by Schiller, is that it represents the first German political problem drama. And problem drama, which means it has to be solved, and if there is a problem, then there are parties involved in it, and certain parties are wrong, therefore they should be criticized, and certain others which are right should be supported. And he continues, the modern drama and Norwegians who produce excellent novels all write with a purpose. So partisanship means writing with a purpose. So your purpose is to present a point of view which is, let us say, sympathetic to those who are honest, those who have integrity, those who have self-respect. I think, however, he says that the purpose must become manifest from the situation and the action themselves without being expressly pointed out, and that the author does not have to serve the reader on a platter, on a plate, the future historical resolution of the social conflicts which he describes. So Engels says that when you are writing a realistic literary piece, then you should always have a purpose in mind, which of course does not mean that you should wear your purpose on your sleeves. It only means that you are aware that there is a purpose that is working behind your writing, and that you are consciously deciding to take sides, and after that you can leave it to the individual characters and the situations. So viewers, by now you would be somewhat clear that realism is not as simple as it might appear, and that it's a doctrine that is very difficult for the writers to properly grasp and inculcate as a kind of strength, and that one has to struggle really very hard in order to be a realistic writer. So you can't become a realistic writer just by telling yourself that you'll be a realistic writer. You have to think of all these situations which are common to most successful and realistic writers. Then there is a third letter from which I quote. This is also from Engels, and this time he is quoting, he is writing to another writer called Margaret Harkness. The previous one was to Minna Kotsky. The more the opinions of the author remain hidden. So I think the argument is taken from the last quotation, that you should be a partisan, but then your partisanship, your sense of purpose should not be clear. If it is clear, then the reader will lose interest. So always keep it hidden, and this is also a point of realism. You see, Balzac, as I quoted, talked about that which is hidden to the eye. So now he says, the writer, the thinker, that is Engels, that the writer should not make clear his partisanship to the reader. He should present it through the representation, through the novel. So the more the opinion of the author remain hidden, the better for the work of art. The realism I allude to may crop out even in spite of the author's opinions. So author's opinion is one thing, but that's not important. The author may have an opinion, but then when one is writing, then maybe some other opinion gains the upper hand. It is possible. The viewers, if you are writers yourself, then you would realize that, particularly in writing a play or writing a short story, things don't remain under complete control of the writer. You might also, those who write would have realized that sometimes you say, well, I don't want to say this, but then this is what will make better sense. So if you say that this will make better sense, even if you don't approve of it, in a way you become a realistic writer, because then you are allowing the reality to escape your discipline and to assert itself directly. So Balzac, whom I consider, says Engels, we started from Balzac, and Balzac is being discussed 50, 60 years later in the 1880s by Engels, and he says, Balzac, whom I consider a far greater master of realism than all the Zolas. Zola was a famous writer of French literature in the 19th century, but there's one Zola, but he's talking about all the Zolas, and past, present, and yet to come. See the anger that the thinker has. In La Comédie Humaine, that is the human comedy, gives us a most wonderfully realistic history of French society. This is what is realism. This is what Balzac achieved and accomplished in his life. He wrote that series of novels called The Human Comedy, and he calls them wonderfully realistic history of French society. So history of society in which there are characters and there are situations, that is called realistic writing. So don't make writing just completely imaginative. Make it follow certain patterns which history has shown to us. Only then can we inch towards what is called realism, especially of La Monde Parisienne, that is the life in Paris, describing chronicle fashion almost year by year from 1816 to 1848. This is a remarkable thing that Balzac achieved. He was active from 1816 to 1848, and he was writing about the life in the villages, life in the small towns, and life in Paris, and he was describing it chronicle fashion, writing from day to day. He says almost year by year from 1816 to 1848. So this is what the writer does. The writer takes up all the details from one's surroundings, from one's environment, and after that he makes them realistic by using the technique of typicality and individuality. And this is what Engels said happened in the case of Balzac. The sentence was not complete in the previous quotation, so I take it from there. Almost year by year, from 1816 to 1848, the progressive inroads of the rising bourgeoisie upon the society of nobles that reconstituted itself after 1815 and that set up again, as far as it could, the standard of old French refinement. Now, this is Engels' comment on those years when Balzac was active in the field of writing in France. And this is what had happened in France at that time, that the bourgeoisie, the middle classes, who would take all the resources in their hands and start producing, it is they who were making inroads into the society of nobles. What he means is that the trader in France, the shopkeeper in France, the person with money in France who had origins in the lower rungs of society, it is this person who was taking over the life in France. And this person was influencing and controlling, or going to control in the process, the nobility in France. Well, there is an interesting thing, and I'd like to share this with you, that in the Balzac, in some of his novels, showed the merchants marrying into the family of nobles. And why? Because the merchant had the money and nobles had the status. So nobles didn't have money, so therefore they needed money. So it so happened that in some cases the daughter of a trader would be offered in marriage to the noble, and noble would have to accept it, but he would say, I'll take so much of money. So in a way, it became a kind of transaction of money between the nobility and the middle class. So in a way, the middle class at that time, the moneyed class at that time in France, was buying husbands for their daughters. So husbands from the nobility became a matter of buying. And this is what Balzac shows very clearly in his novels. So he describes how the last remnants of this, to him, moral society, gradually succumbed before the intrusion of the vulgar moneyed upstart. So of course, when merchants start giving dowry to the nobles, and along with the dowry the daughter, then the daughter becomes a lady, and she will start enjoying a life on a different plane. So now see the attitude of Engels to the middle classes, that is the vulgar moneyed upstart, or were corrupted by him. how the grand dame, whose conjugal infidelities were but a mode of asserting herself in perfect accordance with the way she had been disposed of in marriage, this is the point that I have already explained, gave way to the bourgeoisie who horned her husband for cash or cashmere. Now if women, because they had been used in the transaction as objects, so they would go to the new home and there they would give horns to their husbands, which means that they would carry on affairs with other people behind the back of the husband, and who horn her husband for cash or cashmere, either for cash or for dress. And around this central picture, he groups a complete history of French society, from which even in economic details, and this is what is important, because Balzac was at that point of time studying economic facts much more specifically than even an economist would, and this is what is pointed out. So he was doing his homework. He was doing hard work to capture the reality that was unfolding around him in French life at the time. And then he says, even in economic details, for instance, the rearrangement of real and personal property after the revolution, this was being discussed by Balzac in his novels. And then he says, from that I have learned more than from all the professed historians, economists and statisticians of the period together. So about realism, this can be said that if you read writers of realism, if you read fiction of realism, then you will learn about the real history, not from history books. So therefore Engels is saying here, if you have to know the history of a country, don't go to historians, don't go to economists, don't go to statisticians. What you do is you go to the writers of realism, because it is these people who will pick up the actual details of life and will present characters there, and sometimes you understand the characteristics of a society through the characters picked up by the writers. Then the other point, and this is the last point for so far as Engels is concerned, and this I can take up in some detail, and I don't have much time. Is it possible that I touched upon this point earlier also, but I'll now deal with it in some detail. Is it possible for a writer to think of a situation in one way and write something about it completely opposite to what you think in your writing? Is it possible that I hate a person but I start writing about him, and when I write about him in the novel, then this person becomes respectable? This can happen in realism, and this is what makes a writer realistic, because the writer doesn't allow his prejudices to come in the way of his picking up realism. Realism is that where the actual phenomena is presented in its actual proportions in the society of the period. Therefore, Balzac is a legitimist. This is a person who belongs to the royalty, who is a supporter of the royalty. His great work is a constant elegy on the irretrievable decay of good society. So Balzac in his views is, to use today's terminology, a reactionary, not a progressive. He is not a very enlightened person, in his personal views. He still supports those people who have lost the battle and who will never come to history now, who have disappeared from the social scene for all times to come. The French trader is going towards becoming an industrialist in the 19th century, and this person cannot be now displaced. Balzac knows it, but then his eye is on the inspiring presence of the old lord in the 18th century who lost the battle in French Revolution. So his sympathies are with the class doomed to extinction, but for all that his satire is never keener, his irony never bitterer than when he sets in motion the very men and women with whom he sympathizes most deeply. What does he do actually? He likes the nobles, in life, but when he paints them in his novels, then those nobles become despicable. They become objects of hatred. How does this happen? So in a way, a problem is posed before us by the critic, by the thinker, that in realistic writing, what happens is that your ideas don't matter. Your personal preferences don't matter as a writer. What matters is your eye on the realistic detail around you. The detail that you are capturing, there you should be honest and do not bother about your own ideas and your likes and dislikes. So he dislikes the traders, but when he writes about the traders, then one knows that these traders have a lot of dynamism and strength. But when he writes about nobles whom he likes, then those nobles become objects of hatred. So in a way, and then let's see whether he uses the word there, which I want to come to. His irony never bitterer than when he sets in motion the very men and women with whom he sympathizes most deeply. And the only men of whom he always speaks with undisguised admiration are his bitterest political antagonists, the Republican heroes of the so-and-so, this place, the men who at the time were indeed the representatives of the popular masses. He hates them, but then they become heroes in his novels. That Balzac thus was compelled to go against his own class sympathies and political prejudices, that he saw the necessity of the downfall of his favorite nobles and described them as people deserving no fate, and that he saw the real men of the future where for the time being they alone were to be found. That I consider one of the greatest triumphs of realism. I wanted to come to this particular phrase of Engels, talks about the triumph of realism. So in your writing, if you are realist, you don't succeed. It is your realism that succeeds. If you are keeping your eye on the actual situation and are presenting it in the proportion in which it exists in life, only then your claim to realism is ensured. Otherwise, you will be unjust to and unfair to the society to which you belong and which you want to depict. So, which means that a lot of courage will be required for the realistic writer to write novels, and he has to in fact criticize himself all the time for the prejudices that he or she may have. Friends, there are just a few minutes left now, and we have a very important, a very tall literary critic of realism who lived up to the 1960s, if not 70s. I think he died around 1970. This person is a Hungarian critic. His name is George Lukacs, and it is he who picked up these different effects of these different concepts of realism from the 19th century philosophers and thinkers, and he gave them a shape. And he is a proper critic of realism, Lukacs. In fact, his most famous book is European Realism. There is another book by him which is called Contemporary Realism. There is a third book which is called Historical Novel. There is a fourth book which is called The Theory of the Novel. And in all these, the writer is explaining one after another different aspects of realism. So I just take this quotation, I just read it out, and I'll finish it here. He also talks about characters. Just see, the characters created by the great realists, once conceived in the vision of their creator, live an independent life of their own. This is very important. If I pick up a character to project in my novel, then I pick him up or her. After that, these characters are not in my control. These characters live their own independent existence. Their comings and goings, their development, their destiny is directed by the inner dialectic of their social and individual existence. They have their own compulsions. It is these compulsions will take them in a specific direction, in a certain direction. I can't control the characters from going in this direction or that direction. If that happens, then I am imposing my personal view, which may be wrong, as I have said already. So you allow these characters to be guided by their internal instincts, or what he calls the inner dialectic of their social and individual existence. Once again, see, Lukacs is using that terminology in a slightly different sense. We talked about the typical and the individual, and he is replacing the typical with social, and individual he retains. So their social and individual existence. Your social existence and your individual existence are two different things, but they remain fused into each other in your actual behavior. Or even a truly great writer, if he can direct the evolution of his own characters at will. No writer is a true realist if he can direct the evolution of his own characters at will. So you are not supposed to direct a character at your own will. You allow the character to develop in the way you want. So I finished, friends, here. I say that realism is a very complex doctrine, and it's a doctrine that emphasizes the importance of courage, honesty, and integrity in the writer, and that the writer should always be prepared to criticize himself or herself and to learn from the real play of history around him. So this is how I finish. And
right, sir. Thank you so much for the very interesting presentation, as we got to also read a lot and also learn a lot from you. So friends, today we discussed literary theory and the realism aspect within it, and we looked at the different aspects of realism, and we would request sir to tell us what we would be discussing in the next lecture on literary theory.
You see, because I have come to the end of the 19th century and realism has been discussed, so the 20th century, the entire 20th century literary theory is going to be addressed to the questions that I have already raised in the last 3 lectures. So maybe we can start with a general view of the evolution of the 20th century literary theory, and I'll touch upon each aspect briefly, and then those aspects can be taken separately later on in the further discussions. So 20th century literary theory in general.
Right, friends, so you should all be prepared. Perhaps you could do some preliminary reading or keep your questions ready so that we could answer them. So let us thank sir for being here and for being such a wonderful speaker, and I would also like to thank the viewers and the listeners for watching. Thank you and have a nice day.